Hello, everybody, and welcome. I am Jesse Abelman. I am the curator of Hebraica and Judaica here at the Museum of the Bible. I'd like to welcome you all to our event in conjunction with the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought, where we are celebrating the new release of a wonderful book, Esther in America. Try to get that on camera here. Hard to see with the display. Esther in America, edited by Rabbi Dr. Stu Halpern, who I've known for many years. We have a wonderful panel of speakers and authors, all of whom contributed to the book, to talk to us today. And they are Dr. Leo Leibovitz, Dr. Erica Brown, Dr. Tevi Troy, and finally, the editor himself, Rabbi Dr. Stu Halpern, who also wrote a couple articles for the book. It's a wonderful book, and I'm excited to hear from our authors. You can find their bios in the chat if you want to read up on who they are. And now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Leo Leibovitz.
Thank you so much, Jesse. It is such a pleasure to be here. Although when I see the wonderful screensaver behind you, I'm reminded of how much I've enjoyed visiting the Museum of the Bible, which I've had the occasion of doing most recently, just before we all went under lockdown, and we hope to be again in your wonderful auspices soon. And meanwhile, we're very grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation. I could think of very few people who I would rather hear from than the esteemed colleagues and friends and scholars who join me today. And I want to make sure that we have as much time as we can to hear from them. So I'll be very, very brief. And I will start, as I believe is required by law of me, with an old Hasidic tale. This one is about an elderly rabbi who walks into a very, very posh restaurant, and everyone around is dressed very nicely with fancy clothes, and rabbi's dressed in his, black coat and black hat, and he sits there tiredly at the table, and he sort of looks up at the waiter, and the waiter feels just a wave of disgust towards this man. He can't believe that a person who looks like this has the gall and temerity to walk into this fine, fine restaurant. And so the waiter throws caution to the wind and says, "I'm sorry, sir, we don't serve Jews here." And the rabbi looks at him and says, "That's fine. I don't eat Jews. Now, can you please run to the kitchen and get me some matzo ball soup?" I love this story because it seems to me to embody quite beautifully something profound about the spirit of Purim, something about the moment in which great terror turns to laughter, something about the moment in which an outsider becomes an insider, something about the moment in which the rules get bent because the rules were never just. And most importantly, something about the moment in which the most unlikely people, in the case of our story, the wonderful Esther, who rises from just a Jewish orphan living all the way on the outside, not only to queen of the greatest empire of the time, but to a world historical figure who would change the course of human events and save her people. Something about that story strikes me as completely eternal, as timeless, and I am grateful to acknowledge, courtesy of this wonderful book, which we are here today to celebrate, and of which I have the pleasure of being a part, that I'm not the only person to whom the centrality and the profundity of the book of Esther appealed. We see in this book, in essays that are as diverse as one can imagine, how the story of Purim, how the story of Queen Esther, her uncle Mordechai, King Achashverosh, and the evil Haman spoke to everyone from the early Puritan Cotton Mather, for whom Queen Esther was the very model of womanhood that he aspired to emulate in the newly forming colonies, to a gentleman by the name of Reverend Patton, who appeared to President Abraham Lincoln and urged him to find within himself his inner Esther, his inner courage. And that may or may not have influenced the president's decision several days later to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. There is a tradition in Purim, we're instructed by the Talmud to drink until we cannot tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. And it's a striking phrase the first time you hear it, because you may mistake it to mean that we're commanded to drink until we no longer know the difference between good and evil. But the interpretation that I love best is one that is quite different, is one that says that Purim is a special holiday and the book of Esther is a special book because at the heart of it is this great big moment of teshuvah, the Hebrew word for repentance, because the evil decrees that were set forward and the courage of Queen Esther brought about a whole wave of the Jewish people repenting and returning to their roots, and the whole kingdom, in fact, returning to a higher state of righteousness, which is why we need to find in the cursed be Haman, in the recognition of this ultimate evil, an opportunity to see the good, even in the deepest depths of depravity, even in the darkest moment of history, to recognize that one spark of hope, that one spark of human courage and dignity that will yet return to lighten the moment. And that is the message of the book of Esther. And that is a message that I think we always need, but maybe these days we need it just a little bit more than usual. And so it is my great pleasure to turn it now to far, far wiser people. First of all, speaking about a hidden character, perhaps, from the book, or at least an unsung character who deserves her second or first reconsideration, is my teacher, and I'm proud to say friend, Dr. Erica Brown. I want to take this moment, if you're into books about Esther, and you clearly are because you're here tonight. And by the way, this is also an opportunity to thank all the contributors to this book who are here with us tonight. I urge you also to check out the also recently published and incredible book called The Book of Esther, Power, Faith, and Fragility in Exile by Erica Brown. Dr. Brown, take it away.
Thanks so much, Leo. Thanks to all of you who organized this. It's a gift to be here. It's a dream, really, to be in the Museum of the Bible, teaching about a book that is so precious to me. What I want to talk about tonight is Vashti. Vashti, a minor character. Minor characters have a really important role to play in Esther, and she's got a really interesting history, which we'll talk about tonight. That name, Vashti, is both familiar and unfamiliar to us. We know the name from the book of Esther, but we know pretty little about her, and we're not told much. So I'd like to introduce Vashti using the actual biblical text, discuss the highly charged cocktail of male power and sexuality that determined her downfall, some Talmudic interpretations of Vashti's sorry tale, and then we'll look at the way Vashti was redeemed in American readings of her story that turned this spurned and not well-known queen into a feminist icon. So we'll turn first to the book of to the actual text of the book of Esther, chapter 1, verses 7 to 12. Royal wine was served in abundance, as befits a king, in golden beakers, beakers of varied design. And the rule for the drinking was no restrictions. For the king had given orders to every palace steward to comply with each man's wishes. In addition, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for women in the royal palace of King Achashverosh. On the seventh day, when the king was merry with wine, he ordered Memucha, Nebizta, Charbona, Bigta, Avgata, Zetar, and Karkas, the 7 eunuchs in attendance on King Achashverosh, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing a royal diadem, to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, conveyed by the eunuchs. The king was greatly incensed, and his fury burned within him. Punch drunk with the flush of power, What Achashverosh wished for was a public display of his wife's beauty. He had no hesitation in compromising her dignity. Now, this is, mind you, after a 180-day party. And he intended the same freedom to apply to himself as he virtually demanded of all of those at his party. No restrictions. In wanting his wife and breaking the thin margin of propriety between male and female decorum that characterized these feasts, he was satisfying his lusts by coercing Vashti. All did not have the ability to do as they wished. Some had power, and others found themselves, like Vashti, utterly powerless in this moment. She was certainly powerful in refusing, but that refusal caused her demotion. And we sense the license that this all male free for all offered each man present, and how each may have goaded and enabled the other, an atmosphere conducive to a loss of control and good judgment. This male show of collective royal hedonistic glee that resulted in an abuse of power is reminiscent of an earlier story told in both the Book of Kings and Chronicles, where royal men were encouraged to act badly by other men in a display of force. For example, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon and heir to the throne, was asked to lessen the harsh labor his father imposed on thousands in the building of the temple in his palace. Your father made our yoke heavy, now lighten the harsh labor and heavy yoke which your father laid on us, and we will serve you, as we read in 1 Kings 12:4. When Rehoboam consulted his father's advisors, they said, lighten the load. But Rehoboam then sought the counsel of his peers, who, with the sexual undercurrent of the young and immature, recommended that he act with even greater violence. My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. My father imposed a heavy yoke on you, and I will add to your yoke. My father flogged you with whips, I will flog you with scorpions. Naturally, the strategy that enhanced Rehoboam's authority was more appealing than one that was more just. Privileging power over influence, the youthful king's swagger in the presence of the other male peacocks got the best of Rehoboam, and his poor decision resulted in an insurrection. In our Esther story, we'll see Achashverosh compelled time and again at the council of men who used their power for evil. In the case of Vashti, this power hysteria took the form of subjugating one woman and then ultimately more women, whether by banishing them from the palace, as in Vashti's case, or by consigning them to it for life, as in Esther's story and that of the second harem mentioned in chapter 2 of the book. This state of male freedom and female captivity affected not only the palace, but as a result of his minister's counsel in the Persian postal system, it was to be enforced in every home. What happened in the palace did not stay in the palace. It spilled over everywhere. Modern and traditional understandings of Vashti's character differ greatly. Whereas ancient Jewish commentaries vilify her as a disobedient wife, pocked with pimples and too much moxie, modern writers saw in Vashti a precursor of women's liberation. Vashti was regarded as a heroine by pioneers of the suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucinda Chandler in their book, The Woman's Bible. The Woman's Bible was published in two parts in 1895 and 1898 by a committee of 26 women with Stanton as its lead editor. They set themselves a heady task of undermining interpretations of biblical verses that had women subservient to men. Since the Bible is such an influential book in setting the foundations for a moral society, Stanton understood that she needed to reinterpret it in order to promote a feminist agenda. The book that she conceived was bold, audacious, and a subject of much controversy. Even within the ranks of other women activists, the Women's Bible was questioned. Would the very endeavor to reinterpret the Bible in such an unorthodox way bring shame to women's suffrage? Arguably, it may have been the publication of the Women's Bible that effectively put an end to Stanton's influence in the suffrage movement. Back to Vashti. Vashti, to Stanton and her other committee members, was an ancient iconoclast, a symbol of conviction in the face of exploitation. Vashti is praised along with other more well-known figures like Deborah, and they said, we have some grand types of women presented for admiration in the Bible. Esther, who ruled as well as reigned, and Vashti, who scorned the apostles' command, wives, obey your husbands. She refused the king's orders to grace with her presence in the reveling court. Tennyson pays this tribute to her virtue and dignity. O Vashti, noble Vashti, summoned forth, she kept her state and left the drunken king to brawl in Shushan underneath his palms. This was in contrast in the Women's Bible to Esther's passivity, and I quote, Vashti had exercised heroic courage in asserting womanly dignity and the inherent human right, never recognized by kingship, to choose whether to please and to obey the king. Esther, so as to save her people from destruction, risked her life. Women as queenly, as noble, and self-sacrificing as was Esther, as self-representing and as brave as was Vashti, are hampered in their creative office by the unjust statutes of men. These new female interpreters sought role models of bravery accompanied by self-understanding, and Vashti became their female paradigm of self-determination. And I quote, Vashti stands out as a sublime representation of self-centered womanhood, rising to the heights of self-consciousness and self-respect. She takes her soul into her own keeping, and though her position both as wife and as queen are jeopardized, she's true to the divine aspirations of her nature. Now, between us, the divine aspirations of her nature seem a bit rich to characterize a woman who we know only through her refusal to appear before the king and his comrades. But the early suffragettes needed their mascots, and they found one in Vashti. They neglect to mention here that Vashti was killed or banished for the subversion, her story an instantiation of good intentions destroyed by her failure to be pragmatic. Nevertheless, as Stanton's influence waned, it seemed that Vashti's grew. Tzvi Sinensky, in his treatment of Vashti in our collection, Esther in America, observes that Vashti began to take on a life of her own in the Black community. Vashti became a popular name for Black girls and is the name of the first female elected bishop of the African Methodist Church, Vashti Murphy McKenzie. Many of us recognize the name Vashti from Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. Vashti was Stamp Pade's wife, or from Anna Solomon's 2019 novel, The Book of V. Vashti makes another surprise appearance in a children's book that was published in hardcover just this month, February 2021, Vashti's Comfy Pants by Leah Rachel Berkovitz. And I'd like to read the book's description on Amazon. Why did Queen Vashti, the other Purim royal, refuse to obey her king's commands? Although the traditional biblical text gives us no real clue, this story humorously imagines what it might have been like for a queen to stand up for herself against a string of high-handed demands. In doing so, it demonstrates to children the value of understanding the worth of their own needs and desires. Thus, a woman who is vilified in the book of Esther for insubordination became, several thousand years later, a modern emblem of self-awareness for children. I will close with what I think was, for me, the most unusual use of the name Vashti in America. Many years ago, when living in Newton, Massachusetts, while doing my own doctoral work on Esther at Harvard, I saw one brisk morning my neighbor frantically running after his dog. When he finally caught her, he looked at me and shrugged and said, "We named her Vashti because she never listens." Back to you, Leo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown, for that wonderful introduction. It is now my pleasure to turn the focus over to the harsher lit world of American politics, which few know and understand better than presidential historian, former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the author of many fine books, but the most recent, and I would say my favorite, Fight House, Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump. Dr. Tevi Troy, take us to the world of Purim as reflected in American politics and vice versa.
Thanks, Liel, and it's my favorite book as well, so I appreciate that. I'm on this august panel with Dr. Erica Brown and Dr. Leo Leibovitz and Dr. Tevi Troy, but then we have Rabbi Dr. Stu Halpern. So he clearly is a level of madrega above the rest of us with his extra degree. We're very impressed with that. I don't know what Joseph Epstein would make of all these doctors on a panel and none can do the Heimlich maneuver. But I recall not that long ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I was called by my friend Rabbi Dr. Stu Halpern, and he told me about this exciting book project that he's working on Esther in America. and he asked me about a potential contribution. And Stu, after we finished talking about the Yankees and the latest action movies, we started thinking about Esther's relation to American politics. And he had done some interesting research showing how frequently Esther is mentioned by American politicians. It's actually somewhat striking that you had in the recent White House, Ivanka Trump was called a modern day Esther. In the Clinton White House, you amusingly had Monica Lewinsky, Clinton's Jewish paramour, was called a modern day Esther. And even more interestingly, and perhaps ironic, Hillary Clinton, who was, I guess, cuckolded by Lewinsky, referred to the book of Esther as her favorite book. So Esther kind of has this recurring resonance in American politics. And as Stu and I were talking, it also occurred to me that there's a real parallel between the story of Esther and the modern day First Lady. Now, what do I mean by that? Esther is brought from the house of her cousin, uncle, husband, whatever you want to call Mordecai. The rabbis differ in interpretation on what exactly their relationship was. But Esther is encouraged to go to Ahasuerus's house, the house of Ahasuerus, the Persian king at the time, and become part of his harem. I know when we were in Hebrew school, we were told that there was some kind of beauty contest. I think the beauty contest is a little more sordid now that I look at it with adult eyes. And Esther wins this contest of a sort, and she becomes the leading lady in the harem and sort of effectively Ahasuerus' wife. But she has no independent power other than her relationship, her sexual relationship, as Erica noted, to the king. She has no staff, if you will. She has no independent power or authority. She doesn't control any lands at this point. She's only there because of her relationship with Ahasuerus. And she is quite cognizant of this. And in fact, when Mordecai comes to her and expresses the fact that they have a problem, that this evil man Haman has decided to kill the Jews, and maybe she can help out, she recognizes, well, I can't just go to the king. I don't have that authority. And so she does some smart things. First of all, she directs Mordecai to go and fast and pray, and not just Mordecai, but the entire Jewish community of Shushan. And then she prepares in her own way for going to visit the king. And she knows that she can't just idly go walk into the king's room. You know, in the White House, there's a real question of who has visiting privileges, who has Oval Office privileges. Some people can walk into the Oval Office at any time, usually the chief of staff, maybe some of the senior advisors, and other people can't. They cannot just go willy-nilly in to see the president. Well, the ancient court of Ahasuerus was somewhat like that. And she knows that unlike in the modern White House context, if you go to the throne room unbidden at the time, there's the potential to be threatened with death and punished with death. And so she prepares for this very dangerous visit, and she walks in, and Ahasuerus recognizes her and lets her in. He kind of gives her the grant of authority, and then she comes in, and then she can make a request. And here again, she's very wise politically in that she does not say, oh, Haman's going to kill all the Jews, please stop him, help. Because she knows that may not be a fruitful approach. The king is very close to Haman. Haman is given all these talents of silver in order to do this thing. He's obviously won over Ahasuerus' heart to engage in this terrible act. And so she just asks him to do something simple, come to a party. And he goes to the party, she says to bring Haman to. Haman, according to the rabbis, is very wary going into this party. But she kind of soothes him by not really doing anything dangerous or worrisome in this party. And the only thing she asks at that party is that they come to another party. And so now Haman is somewhat comforted. He thinks that she just likes to throw parties. And the next day, after this is the third engagement, she finally drops the hammer and she says that there is an evil man who is out to kill her people. And the king gets angry and says, who is this? And she points to Haman and says, Haman, the evil man. And Haman unwisely falls on her couch to beg for forgiveness. And the king, in a rage, thinks that he's making a play for her, if you will. And one of her advisors says that has the wisdom to cover Haman's head. And Haman's face is never again seen by the king after that moment. So she outmaneuvers him using her wisdom and her political savvy, not necessarily the power that is inherent in her position. And so when I looked back at this story and I revisited the story, looking at a lot of the rabbinical commentary for my chapter in the book, I started to think about the parallels with the modern day First Lady, because the First Lady is one of two people in a modern White House who cannot be fired. Those two people are the First Lady and the Vice President. And that gives them some power, some authority, some staying power, if you will. We often see in the White House there's a lot of turnover. But she also, kind of like the Vice President, has no independent authority. The Vice President is the President of the Senate, which matters, I guess, if you have a 50-50 divided Senate like we do now. But ordinarily, the Vice President has little to do. And in fact, when Lyndon Johnson was Vice President, he was incredibly frustrated because he felt impotent. He felt like he had very little to do in that capacity. But the First Lady also has very little to do statutorily or constitutionally. Her role is really what she makes of it. And if someone like Lyndon Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, wants to make her role about the beautification of American roads, usually the American people say, that's great, we're all for it. But if the First Lady wants to get involved in something more substantive or controversial, like Hillary Clinton did with Hillary Care and the healthcare initiative, well, there's often pushback. Now, Hillary definitely got a lot more criticism as First Lady than Lady Bird did. She also had a lot more power. So with the risk comes the opportunities as well. And what I've seen in my studies of the First Ladies and looking at it in the context of Esther is sometimes the First Ladies are really wise about how they use their power. So I think about Betty Ford, who liked to speak out about issues that were sometimes contrary to what her husband's administration was pushing. And sometimes Ford's advisors like Dick Cheney, who was Deputy Chief of Staff, and Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Chief of Staff, would go to her and say, hey, your wife is saying this stuff, you got to get her to stop. And he would say to them, Ford would say, her office is right down the hall, you go tell her. And that kind of conferring of authority by the president to her allowed her to go and continue to speak out. But if the president hadn't backed her, she really would have had no leg to stand on. And I guess Betty Ford knew her husband. She knew that she could get away with that. And I'm also reminded, and I spent a lot of time in the chapter on the story of Nancy Reagan. Nancy Reagan was known as a very involved spouse. She didn't want to get involved in policy like Hillary Clinton did. She didn't want to drive a specific issue, but she was very concerned about Ronald Reagan's image. And in fact, there usually had to be a staffer on what was called the mommy watch, because Reagan would call Mrs. Reagan, who would call Nancy mommy. That was her nickname for him, his nickname for her. And the mommy watch meant the staffer who was kind of minding Mrs. Reagan to make sure that she wasn't getting too involved in things or causing too much trouble. And if she didn't like a staffer, that was really bad news for the staffer. So for example, Ed Meese was Reagan's chief of staff when he was governor and thought he would be chief of staff in the White House. But Mrs. Reagan was one of the people who thought that he wasn't up to the job. And indeed, Jim Baker ended up becoming the chief of staff in the White House and was a close ally of Mrs. Reagan. And Baker was always careful to be close to Mrs. Reagan and be on board with her. And his deputy chief of staff, Mike Deaver, was known as one of the people in the White House who was closest to Mrs. Reagan. But when Baker left, he was replaced by Don Regan. Don Regan was a former Marine. He was the chairman of Merrill Lynch, kind of a gruff guy, and he wanted to be in charge of everything in the White House. The line that Mrs. Reagan said about him, his position of chief of staff, is he likes the chief part, but he doesn't really get the of staff part. So she very early sussed him out and saw that he was a problem. And they used to fight, and they would get on the phone with each other and they would argue. And at one point, Regan, in a fit of anger, hangs up the phone on Nancy Reagan. And Jim Baker, the former chief of staff, hears about this. And remember, he was always careful with Mrs. Reagan. And he said, that's not a firing offense, that's a hanging offense. So he recognized just what a problem it was. And indeed, it did have a firing impact on her, on him, in that Don Regan didn't last that much longer after that part. But then an interesting thing and an interesting parallel to the Purim story comes up, in that when Regan leaves, he takes his own revenge. And his revenge is in the memoir where he highlighted Mrs. Reagan's interest in astrology and how astrology determined many of the scheduling decisions in the Reagan White House. And the reason astrology is so interesting is because Haman drew lots, and he was interested in an astrological reason to find the specific date that was best for his evil mission of destroying the Jews. So I really enjoyed writing this chapter at Stu's direction in terms of finding the parallels between modern day politics and the ancient story of Queen Esther. And I think as we have a new First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, I know we always have to say the doctor, I think that she also is going to have to figure out her way to navigate herself through the Byzantine and often dangerous pathways of the White House. And all Americans, I think, should wish her well in her efforts. And maybe she should look to the story of Queen Esther to get some guidance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Troy. You indeed were correct to observe that our next and final speaker outranks us all by being not only a doctor, but also a rabbi. And we're proud to say a good friend. It is no coincidence that Stu is the animating force behind the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought, because there are very few people who bring together these two values, who shine a clearer, stronger, brighter light on the way that the Hebrew Bible illuminates and inspires so much of Western thought and so much of American history. And this book is really, I think, a shining example of taking something that you might think belongs in the dusk of antiquity, and in fact positioning it right here in the center of our very American, very contemporary lives. So Dr. Rabbi Halpern, take us home.
Thank you so much, Liel. I appreciate it. The fall of 1853 was a fearful time for escaped slaves in America. Uncle Tom's Cabin had just been published only a year prior. The argument that Black people should not be bought and sold had to be made in fiction before it could be settled in reality. Into the fiery cauldron of an American polity, later to be rendered asunder by civil war, on September 7th, 1853, walked a 56-year-old escaped slave given the name Isabella Baumfree at birth. Now, you might recognize her by the name she had given herself as an adult, Sojourner Truth. On that September day, Truth walked slowly to a podium at what was scheduled to be a women's rights convention in New York City. 3,000 people had peacefully assembled to advocate for equality, but they found themselves heckled and hounded by hundreds of hostile protesters who sought to slow the advancement of the righteous cause of freedom and equal opportunity for all Americans. So hate-filled, so vile were these disruptors that history dubbed what happened that day the mob convention. Yet Sojourner Truth was undaunted. Amidst the hisses and howls from those trying to interrupt both her speech and her cause, she began her remarks. They were not written in advance, for she could neither read nor write. In her speech, she spoke not of political strategies, nor the depths of her personal narrative, but rather, surprisingly, shockingly even, in this moment, an amalgam of tension, fear, and unyielding determination, Sojourner Truth chose to focus on a Jewish heroine in ancient Persia, whom the Bible tells us risked her life for the sake of saving her people. There was a king in the scriptures, Truth said, and then it was the kings of the earth would kill a woman if she come into their presence. But Queen Esther come forth, for she was oppressed and felt there was a great wrong. And she said, I will die or I will bring my complaint before the king. Should the king of the United States be greater or more crueler or more harder? But the king, he raised up his scepter and said, thy request shall be granted unto thee. To the half of my kingdom will I grant it to thee. Then he said he would hang Haman on the gallows he had made up high. But that is not what women come forward to contend. The women want their rights as Esther. Standing up to her racist, misogynist detractors, Truth won not only the evening's debate, but more importantly, eventually, her historical mission for justice and equality. He had recalled Esther's courage in foiling the villainous advisor Haman's plot to destroy the Jews through her daring appeal to the nation's highest ruler. Little wonder then that Esther's story resonated with President Abraham Lincoln as well. As Liel mentioned, 9 days before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln was approached by a pastor from Chicago named William Weston Patton, accompanied by a group of other clergymen. Patton, in the short time he had been granted with Lincoln, decided to remind the president of Esther's tale. Quoting Mordecai's request of Esther that she risk her standing and her stature to achieve the salvation of her people, Patton asked, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And your memorialists believe that in divine providence, you have been called to the presidency to speak the word of justice and authority, which shall free the bondman and save the nation. Lincoln listened, finding courage of his own, and like Esther, abolished a great evil. As we detail in our book, at every turn from our founding to the current moment, Americans have been inspired by Esther. So why does her story resonate? After all, there are plenty of tales, biblical and non, that can offer Americans inspiration and guidance. The Exodus story, for example, has long influenced how Americans have perceived their own history. But there's something about Esther. Nowadays, it is so easy to look, this book of Esther is the only book in the Bible in which God is not mentioned. Nowadays, it's so easy to look towards someone else, towards some other entity for redemption, to come and save us. We turn to politicians, to pundits, artists, and even athletes, and the groupthink of social media crowds. We pump our fists at clever hot takes, sit comfortably and cheer as hashtags go viral, and are satisfied that others are taking care of what needs to be done, at least with their thumbs. But Esther teaches us that salvation is not something that appears magically from some other place. True inspiration is not to be found on someone else's Instagram. It is on us, on our individual, human, moral actions, on our choices, on our courage to actually do what is right, that the potential for salvation rests. Esther's story reminds us that unity need not mean uniformity. In the vast empire of ancient Persia, as the book of Esther tells us, each person was allowed to speak their own language. But this purported respect for the other hardly celebrated their actual uniqueness. It was window dressing for what was in fact compulsory cultural conformity. By refusing to bow down to this mentality, by being marked by Haman as too different, too loyal to their own unique beliefs, the Jewish people found themselves in danger. Esther and Mordecai's courageous actions to defend their people and their traditions then remind us that when discrimination, when prejudice is present, it must be strategically called out. We must stand in defense of the dignity of difference. Esther and Mordecai's morally heroic actions remind us that a polity can only truly flourish when uniqueness, when traditions, when cultures are not squashed in the name of unity, but are celebrated for what they contribute to diversity. Esther reminds us of the importance of choosing covenant over comfort and ethics over opulence. Esther, when she was asked by Mordecai to risk her life on behalf of her people, was in the literal lap of nobility. Living in the royal palace with servants at the ready and her every wish easily granted, she could have reveled in her status without pause and without hesitation. And yet she chose loyalty to her family, to her people, and to their ancient traditions. Her choice is like so many that we are faced with today. For people of faith, for people loyal to centuries-old customs, the cushion rope of assimilation constantly tempts us away with its conveniences and its comforts. Elite institutions of higher learning who bear the slogans of truth too easily slide into unyielding disdain for ancient sources of wisdom, or respectful dialogue with those whose manner of dress, whose faith strikes them as backwards or outdated. In the workplace, wearing traditional head coverings, stepping outside to pray, or not choosing to eat certain foods will inevitably lead to quizzical looks and skeptical questions. But Esther reminds us not to exchange differences for decadence. She reminds us that politicians and political policies should empower us, not embarrass us. And she reminds us that those who are proud of their heritage ultimately elicit respect and admiration. From our country's founding to its most pivotal moral moments, from the colonial era to the American Revolution, to the fight against slavery, to the fight for women's rights, to modern politics, Esther's story has guided Americans. Her 2,500-year-old tale has resonated throughout the ages and throughout American history, and we would be wise to continue to apply her teachings for such a time as this.
Amen to that. I would like to invite anyone who has not done so yet to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to any or all of us. We will try to leave some time to address them, but meanwhile, I want to take the privilege and ask the first few. Dr. Rabbi, but also Dr. Brown and Dr. Troy, you're all both historians and scholars of the Book of Esther. I'm wondering if you while thinking and researching this book, have noticed different ways or different emphases that different generations of Americans have taken to the Book of Esther. Were there particular aspects of the book that appealed more in different points in American history? Are there different kind of morals or lessons that were drawn, or is it pretty much the same kind of universal drumbeat beating through the centuries?
So I think that Americans from the founding era, and this has been lost a little bit in today's day and age, very regrettably, had at their disposal, came naturally to them, the moral language of liberty provided by the Hebrew Bible. I think from the time of the Puritans and the Pilgrims through the Revolution, the Bible, the words of the Bible were, as one historian has put it, as common as the air that they breathed. And I think it came naturally to early Americans to think about their own eras through the prism of the Hebrew Bible. So in the American Revolution, for example, in the decade before, when King George III, otherwise known as the villain from Hamilton, was enacting oppressive policies to the colonists saw this oppressive king who was in their mind being manipulated by conniving prime ministers like Lord North in England as Achashverosh. They saw George III as Achashverosh, and they saw Lord North as Haman. And we have sermons and journalistic accounts from the time whereby they were trying to, at least initially, excuse the behavior of King George III as maybe not really his fault. Maybe he was just a king being manipulated by a conniving second in command. But as things got worse, they realized that maybe George III was to blame. Maybe he was, in his later manifestation, the sort of spitting, angry, oppressive king who, of course, was enacting these oppressive taxation policies to remind us of his love. And I think that this has been lost, this sort of natural affinity for seeing one's own story through the biblical lens has unfortunately been lost in the modern age. I think having a unifying story is something that America so desperately needs nowadays. And I think it's only natural and fitting that we return to what has been our original founding story, our founding moral language that we've had, and that's the language of the Hebrew Bible.
Dr. Brown, would you like to add to that?
First of all, I'd like you to call me Erica, please. Dr. Brown is a soda, and right now we're among friends. I'm not grading your papers at the university. Well, I'm not going to speak about it so much from the lens of American history as Stu did, Rabbi Doctor. What I want to do is I actually have been very struck by how many people have shared with me that Esther, the text of Esther and Esther's decision, how do you know you haven't gotten here to this royal position for just this moment, has really guided them in making certain key decisions about expanding their own sphere of influence. And I could imagine that for people who, people of faith, who are in political situations where they've made decisions, they're making decisions to rise in the ranks, that moment, how do you know that this isn't your moment? Notice Mordechai asks a question. He doesn't say this is your moment. Just how do you know it's not your moment? And I agree with Stu's assessment, although I can say that I see so many of my own decisions through the lens of the Bible. That's also a text that I'm intimate with, and I do see people who have that intimacy with it, but sadly not enough people. Things like the Psalms, where have given language to healing, to fear, to loneliness, to happiness. So I think that there is a language that's missing. But I do want to say two observations that have changed for me reading Esther as a child and reading Esther as an adult. The first is when I was little, of course, every young child, girl wants to be Purim, Esther on Purim, or I shouldn't say everyone, but maybe, but I certainly did for many, many years, and outgrew my Purim, my Esther costume. But as I got older, I started understanding the sexual orientation of the book. And Achashverosh's, not only, the women who were deflowered by Achashverosh never went home. There was a large second harem of women who probably never were seen by the king again. Gore Vidal had a really immense influence on me in his book Xerxes. Reading about this, this sort of labyrinth of women trapped forever. And the other thing is, if you pay careful attention to Esther, as I did in writing a commentary, there's so much about bureaucracy and government and how long it takes to make a decree and the role of ministers and the inefficiency of the postal service. I think I wasn't aware of those aspects of political life that certainly living in a DC suburb has made me exquisitely sensitive to now.
Dr. Troy, anything to add?
Yes, I would. Look, this is a 2,500-year-old story, but we're constantly finding new and modern interpretations. And I think in the modern political context, you often see reference to the book of Esther with the lens of Israel upon it. Is somebody a modern day Esther in that they can help Israel in the context of American views towards Israel? So I think that's one interesting new take on it that was not a take that existed before Israel's creation in 1948. A second lens is in recent years, it's also seen sometimes in the context of the Iran nuclear program and Iran's nuclear ambitions. In fact, Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, gave Obama a copy of the book of Esther as a kind of way to remind him that previously we've had other Persian nations with territorial ambitions, and that they were, and with the ambition to destroy the Jews, in fact, which is what Haman's express purpose was. And the Iranians have made similar comments. So I think the book is ancient, but the interpretations are modern, and we're going to see more of them into the future.
We're getting a host of questions, but I do want one last of my own, and I will ask you, just in the interest of getting to all of them, to keep things a bit on the briefer side. I am impressed, both Erica from your book and Stu from your comments, with the deep undercurrent, or perhaps current, of duality that flows through the book of Esther. The idea that this book is about people kind of balancing two identities. It's Jews living in exile. It's also religious people living in a sort of modern big empire nation that has values that are very different from their traditional values, that are focused on wanton sexuality and sort of all-out excess. I think this notion of trying to kind of fit in a society that doesn't feel quite right is one that probably unites a lot of us here tonight or listening in. So I was wondering what the book of Esther has to tell us about resolving this conflict. Or
Eric, would you like to go first?
I will allow you to go first. I went first last.
Sure. So I see actually a question in the chat, which I think ties into this, which is, what do we know about Esther's children? And the answer is, we don't know anything about Esther's children. In fact, the Bible doesn't tell us if Esther had children at all. And if I could, I'd like to contrast that with the biblical book of Ruth, because Ruth, of course, ends with a genealogy, with a 3,000-year-old, spoiler alert. It ends with a genealogy that ends with King David, and eventually, by implication, the Messiah. And so the book of Ruth, situated as it is in the land of Israel, actually signals the flourishing of the biblical people, the people of Israel, in the land of Israel, with the king and eventually with the Messiah. Now, Esther, as an exilic book, can't possibly have such an ending. Esther, some have even argued, ends almost tragically, because the Jews at the end of the book, the people of Israel, are not actually in Israel at the end of the book. And Esther, we have no idea if she ever makes it out of the palace, if she has children who lead their own children back to the land of Israel. We don't know. We're never told. And it could be that there's something inherent in this duality, as Tavi mentioned, this idea of being both part of a people and yet looking to the land of Israel as a real homeland. We know that President Abraham Lincoln referred to America, referred to the United States as the almost chosen nation, the almost chosen people. And that's because America has long been modeled over the Israelite model of the Holy Land. And so I think Esther, specifically not being in the Holy Land, is signaling how in life outside of Israel, the question of continuity remains an open question for the people of Israel.
Yeah, I'm actually, very struck, Liel, that when you open the book, you get a description of Achashverosh's palace. And we don't have many buildings in the Hebrew Bible. We have the Mishkan, the tabernacle. And to me, and to a number of medieval commentators, that start of the book, taking us to a party, taking us to this building, which was a source of fascination for those in the empire, suggests an imbalance of values in the diaspora, the sense of excessiveness, of unjust behavior, of the ridiculing or parroting of the government, I think suggests that Jews should feel some degree of tension, not only to Stu's well-articulated point about Jewish loyalties and where they lie, but really the Jewish responsibility to make the current government that they're in a better and more just government. And so to me, it's very significant that we end the book only with 3 verses, but those 3 verses have Mordechai helping economically Achashverosh return to fiscal responsibility through taxation, and also that Mordechai took this position much as Joseph, and there's a lot of comparisons. Sandra Beth Berg wrote a doctorate comparing Joseph and Esther and the many resonances between these 2 stories, and she's only one of many scholars who've done so, that Joseph was good only in as much as he negotiated these tensions so that he could do good for his people and do good for the government in which he lived. And I think that sets, to me, rather than a tension, it sets an aspiration, right? Of course there's tension. And of course, in all of these stories, in Moses' story, in Esther's story, in the story of Jews in royal courts, in Joseph's story, in Mordechai's story, there's a sort of watershed moment when there are decisions that one has to make about one's primary identity. But I think we have to hold fast to the responsibility to do good for the governments in which we find ourselves, not only to protect ourselves, but because we're interested in justice and good governance.
Dr. Troy?
In the interest of letting more questions out, I'll let it stand with that.
All right, so we have 3 ones. I mean, we have many great ones, but 3 ones come to mind, and I will ask them in rapid order. God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, asks Kurt Byron, but presumably he's in the background someplace. In thinking about the book of Esther in America today, what is the role of God?
I think we should let Tevi take that.
Only fair.
Look, Stu and I just recently wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about the Bible and the inauguration. And we found something very interesting, that in the first 100 years or so of this nation, first 29 presidents, the Bible was only mentioned about 11 times in the inaugural event, in the inaugural addresses. In the subsequent 30 presidential inaugurals, the Bible was mentioned 23 times. So I know people like to lament that we're a more secular society today, but it's clear that the American people continue to yearn for some kind of connection to religion, to our past, and to God. And I think that as long as this American Republic stands, we're going to continue to have that kind of yearning for the God-given rights that we all have and the inspiration that God gave in the terms of what the founders saw in creating the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
And if I could piggyback off that, Kurt, I think what's so amazing about the book of Esther is exactly what you alluded to, that there's this subtext of God's hidden hand behind the scenes the entire time, but it goes unmentioned. And I think what's so incredible about the Jewish holiday of Purim is that it's celebrated as if it's a divine holiday. Why? Because the actions undertaken by the very human heroes, the very human heroine of the book, are stamped with divine approval. And so the idea, the message of the book, that's something that you do, something that humans do to save their people, to stand up for what is right, can meet divine approval and be commemorated for all time, can reverberate throughout the generations, is, I think, an important lesson of the book of Esther. So I think in our own day in America, we can continue to take this message with us, that we can really shape history in a way that can be divinely sanctioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot when I read the book of Esther of the Talmudic expression "Ein somchin al hanes." We don't rely upon miracles, and and I want to change that translation a little bit. We don't expect miracles, right? So in a climate in which we don't expect miracles, we see a certain human responsibility to have agency and bring about change. Now, among medieval and pre-modern commentaries, there's a preoccupation with finding God, finding all kinds of hidden allusions to God. And yet, if you read the story as a whole, you understand God's hovering presence over everything. It's how things could have turned out versus the way that they did turn out. That's a little different than apocryphal literature, where God is mentioned all over this book. So that's also an important sort of scholarly source in thinking about, is God present or is God not present? In some ways, it depends on the book of Esther you're reading.
Emily Schneider asks, what do the panelists think about the fact that when we teach the story today, especially to young people, Esther's heroism is irreducibly connected to her youth and beauty? What does that say about women's ability to act heroically in the absence of these qualities?
Well, first, I'd like to thank Emily Schneider for her wonderful contribution to the book on the depiction of Esther in children's literature. So I think for more on this fascinating topic, check out Emily's chapter. And I don't want to be presumptuous to speak about women's education, but I think what we're trying to show with this book overall, of which we're so glad that Emily contributed, is how Esther's messages are obviously far beyond and have extended and echoed far beyond that of her beauty, but more in the realm of her courage and in her principles. And so hopefully by putting this book out there, these messages will continue to become known by a wider swath of people beyond simply historians.
I noticed that Stu did not actually answer the question. I'm just saying.
I left that to you.
No, Emily, I really appreciated that question. I was reading it in the chat. And I want to make sure that it's not only seen as a female issue. Beauty is, in this sense, both male and female, because Joseph is also described very similar language of being beautiful, and his beauty being a platform upon which he can mingle with those who will have power over him, and eventually whom he will have power over. But also, beauty is a source of danger in the Joseph story. It's what makes the wife of Potiphar attracted to him, and it makes him make certain kinds of decisions. So the way that I read beauty is that the beauty is almost the beginning platform by which you gain access. And then after you have access, the question is, what are you going to do with that? Now, that's not true for every biblical story. I think we don't hear about the beauty of biblical characters, male or female, very often. In this case, I think it's tied into a criticism of the government. This sort of royal who wants beautiful women and then treats them in a way that's disposable. That's not in the Women of Valor from Proverbs 31. We say sheker achein v'hevel hayofi, right? Beauty can be deceitful.
One more question, and let's make this a lightning round. From an anonymous attendee, which works of visual art portraying Esther or Vashti are your favorite and why? And I'd like to extend this to any kind of real reference to Esther or the book of Esther, anything that you came across in this book or elsewhere, in 30 seconds or less.
I'll go first. A few years ago, my wife and I were privileged to go to the Mormon temple in Philadelphia before it was consecrated, which would allow them to let me in, because they don't let non-believers in, and to let me on the religious side allowed me to go in, because as a religious Jew, I'm not supposed to go there. So I went there, and they had the most gorgeous depiction in a painting of Esther. And they asked me, as the Jewish person there, if I was familiar with the Jewish story or with the biblical story of Esther. Of course I was, but I was just taken by that beautiful haunting picture of her that resides in the Mormon temple in Philadelphia that people cannot see, unfortunately, unless you are Mormon and live in the Philadelphia area, but it's there nonetheless.
Erica?
Yeah, for me, it's probably Sandro Botticelli's depiction on one of the marriage caskets. He had one of Mordecai and one of Esther, and it's just a beautiful depiction of her alone. Most of the depictions, she's with a lot of people, and in the text too. Here, she's just alone right before she enters the gate, and I think it's just very, very profound moment.
Rabbi Doctor.
So I would direct our viewers to the chapter by Rabbi Mishael Tzion in our book about a fascinating depiction of the Purim story through the prism of the Holocaust by Zik. And I think it's incredible to see how even in the depths of despair during the era of the Holocaust, the way people saw that tragedy and the evil that was happening was through the prism of Esther, and actually gave them some comfort to think just as that challenge had been overcome, this too would be overcome.
On that note, I wish again to thank Dr. Troy, Dr. Brown, Dr. Halpern, and Jesse Edelman and everyone at the Museum of the Bible for this wonderful, wonderful hospitality. It has been our absolute pleasure. And as we say, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, may we all be next year, not just in Jerusalem, but in the Museum of the Bible in person together.
Thank you so much to all of our participants. It's been really a great pleasure to hear you all speak and to learn from you. And I'm excited to continue reading the book. I hope our participants will all pick up a copy. There's a lot to learn. I just want to quickly mention our next program, which will be taking place on March 25th. You can register for it on our website beginning in March. It's called Myths and Mistakes with Elijah Hickson and Peter Gurry. So check that out. It should be very interesting and a lot of fun. And again, thank you so much to all of our participants. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you to the entire audience for coming. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.